Well, it's nice to see who the real marathoners are on a day like this, and they're all sitting out there, and we certainly appreciate your sticking with it, because we spent perhaps a little more time than we had intended during the course of the panels on the description of the situation, the bringing us up to date with some very interesting presentations from people who are involved in the big issues right now. And this panel is going to start the turn to the questions of what can we do better in the future? What are the initiatives that can be taken by the United States and Japan, by the governments, by private sectors, by civil society, non-governmental organizations that would overcome the obstacles that are still in the way of Myanmar's development, that would speed up progress where it's being made. So two of us on this final panel were on earlier panels, and we have two new members, but both of whom are very experienced. Jim Schoaf not only ran a conference a little over a year ago on this same subject of U.S.-Japanese cooperation on Myanmar, but he's written a recent report which I recommend to all of you with some excellent ideas. So Jim, I hope you'll be free to use those ideas that are good. And Yamanouchi-san from the currently with the embassy here in Washington, but with a deep and long experience in Southeast Asia and knowledge of Japan's programs towards Myanmar and of Myanmar itself. And so, Yamanouchi-san, all of the ideas that you've had for the past 30 years, you're welcome to give them to us, and we'll see what we can do. So we'll start with my thoughts on the subject of civil-military relations, and then we'll go to David Steinberg to talk about the issues of multi-ethnicity and democracy and recommendations that we can make, and then we'll move to Jim Schoaf and end with Yamanouchi-san. So in the description of the current state of civil-military relations, I think we were all struck by the limited way in which the United States and Japan are involving themselves with this extremely important component of Myanmar's transition. As Mary Callahan told us, you can sum up what the United States is doing in three short sentences involving, sounds like about half a dozen people. And General Yamaguchi told us about the expanding number of Myanmar military students who will be coming to military academies, military defense universities in Japan, but again, pretty small numbers. And I don't think that we can escape the recommendation on both sides that the work with the armed services of Myanmar by both the United States and by Japan ought to be increased in view of the centrality of the Tatmandar's role in society. So I think our first recommendation should probably be just an increase in the scale. That runs into no legal restrictions in Japan. It does run into congressional restrictions in the case of the United States, leaving us two choices, both of which I think we should pursue. One is to try to ease those congressional restrictions so that military-to-military actions that can assist Myanmar's development are are no longer prohibited by congressional sanctions. And the second path to take is that non-governmental assistance from the United States, from organizations that have military experience but are not part of the government, can be engaged to help with many facets of Myanmar's transition. I think the next implicit recommendation that came out of our discussions was to look for others who can help in this important subject. And the one that comes to mind that we discussed briefly in the panel was Indonesia. If the armed services of Myanmar took much of their inspiration from across the Malacca Strait in the days of the Dwi Fungsi and the ABRI domination of Indonesian life, then there's a counterexample now which Indonesia is developing, in which the Indonesian Armed Forces is withdrawing itself from the fabric of Indonesian society, resuming a more structured, a more defined role, actually giving up some of its responsibilities in the civil sector, and that certainly is the path that the armed services of Myanmar eventually have to travel. And so I think working with Indonesia to assist Myanmar ought to be a very, very strong component. Indonesia is doing a lot on its own anyhow, but I think that the United States and Japan teaming up with Indonesia to make sure that we're coordinating this effort would also be a good one. There were several areas that are essential for military reform eventually in Myanmar that we did not address in a great deal of detail, but one we did talk about quite a bit was this simultaneous necessity to pull the Myanmar armed forces out of private activities, but then to provide central government funding for the operating expenses of the Myanmar armed services, so that the troops can be paid adequately, so that the equipment can be purchased, and so that Tarabadoa has what it needs to do its mission of external defense and of the support to civil authorities in internal matters. Many other countries have gone through this transition. There are plenty of examples of things that seem to work in some context and things that don't work in other contexts. So I think it's worthy of further exploration as to whether there could be any form of advice and assistance to Indonesia, both within the to Myanmar, both within the Ministry of Finance, within the armed services, as to how you make a transition like that. If a transition like that is handled badly, as it has been in some countries, it leads to further troubles. If soldiers are not paid enough money to take care of themselves and their families, they set up roadblocks and raise their own funds. If colonels and generals are not making enough money to support their families, then corruption creeps in at higher levels. So there's certainly a lot of details to be worked out there, and I think it's worth exploring whether the United States and Japan and other countries can help at least think that through, recognizing that the timeline that it will take will be extended. And then finally, there's the I think the question of that Frank Januzzi raised in particular about the military justice system reconciliation and accountability. This is probably the hardest area for outsiders to come in and attempt to prescribe to a country what it should do, since these things are at the very heart of national identity, of the roles of the different interest groups in society. And I'm not sure that this is something that outsiders can play that much of a role in, especially outsiders from very developed and mature civil military relations countries such as the United States. So from hearing people talk this morning, I'm not sure if that's one that we can contribute something useful or not. And then finally, I think the last thing, which I think would apply across many of our panels, is that although there is, based on past assistance, there seems to be a pattern of Japan specializing in some sort of assistance and the United States specializing in other sorts of assistance. It seems to me a little bit more mixing of the two types of assistance in order to give each an appreciation for the approach and the problems of the other would be worthwhile. So I would certainly in the military relations area recommend that the United States and Japan get together to ensure that Japan has some programs having to do with improving civil military relations, where it's quite limited right now, so that both countries have a little skin in the game across the board of assistance programs and don't simply work on a specialized area and not understand and not contribute to more across the board. So those would be my tentative thoughts coming out of the civil military relations area. But David, what about your panel?
Well, let me go to sort of a whole series of thoughts on aspects of the conference so far. It includes our panel, but it goes on beyond that.
Please.
One of the issues that wasn't raised is that we stress civil society, and USA stresses civil society, but Japan has a civil society program in its foreign aid program. And we don't talk about the possible collaboration of NGOs, Japanese and international and Western American NGOs, on areas of specific need, where one doesn't try and tell them what to do, but it does mean that there are things that there may be complementary, there may be joint projects that are possible, and it seems to me that it wouldn't hurt to explore that. One of the things that occurred to me, if we're talking about the military, of course, the exact size of the Tamada is a question. Wang Myo has, I think, feels it's much less than the official figures indicate. But the problem is, what do you do with demobilized soldiers if you really want to lower the military budgets and military prisons? The issue of training, technical training. In Korea in the 1960s, every automobile mechanic, every sort of blue-collar worker was trained by the military. And there were no schools for training these people, but the military trained them so that when they got out of the military, there were things they could do. What is being done in Myanmar, this sort of thing? Are we thinking about this issue? I think there's something that we could learn from each other on that. Another issue is the question of the minority areas. Now, Japan is beginning to work in minority areas, but Japan has an advantage. Every country around Myanmar has supported either rebels or dissidents. The UK supported them. The US has supported them as well, even until recently in Thailand, but also the KMT before. Many Burmese are very suspicious of our roles with the military because, A, some of these are Christians, so therefore we're prejudiced in favor of those Christians. But Japan doesn't have that problem. Well, Japan has tried to do certain things that I haven't approved of once, where they tried to produce soba noodles in the Wa state. I'm not kidding. This was more theater than economic development because it cost so much to ship these back to Japan. They could buy them in China for far less. So that really didn't work. But there are things that could be done, and when Japan may be more acceptable in some of these sensitive areas than the United States would be. And so I think that there are things to think about coordination on that. There's a question that was raised that I think we have to consider on the military, and that is what we talked about in the issue of the professional military, to avoid that particular term, because it has come up so often in my conversations with people, this mercenary attitude. And one of the things the United States has not realized in our dealings with that country is that these people are very patriotic. And they are doing things for love of country. Of course, there are the usual people who will seek rents and so forth, but there are people who do this for love of country, and we have to recognize that and somehow be able to work with them. Admiral Blair and his panel didn't mention the question of civilian control of the military. I thought that was an interesting absence, because one of the issues in Congress right now, there is this bill in the House that says the military ought to be under civilian control. But of course, that dichotomy is in a sense false, because civilian control and military control are not absolutes. I mean, after all, President Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, which muddies the waters a good bit, it seems to me, when you talk about the separation. So I think that it's got to be some.
And as we heard, a lot of the civilians are ex-military officers in the
right.
in the government. Right.
And one of the things about training people is that if you look at the recent statistics, virtually all of the director generals and deputy director generals are former military in the Myanmar government. Half of the directors and deputy directors of various ministry departments are also military. So the military has pushed these people into position as this will change, because as you pointed out, or somebody pointed out, that the intake, the graduate class from the military academy is down from 2,000 to 500, which will mean that can be absorbed more inside the military. Questions of law. We stress in our aid program law, but as a recent paper by a young, brilliant researcher at Harvard shows, the question of law is different from the question of justice. And in the Myanmar situation, with the complete control by the executive branch over the judicial system, there are issues that ought to be looked at. The simplistic view of law alone and the rule of law with capital letters, I think, is not really sound. The question of the military and business. The Vietnam Constitution, if I recall correctly, talks about the development of factories that will employ retirees from the military and military families. It's something that they need to do. There's so many of them. But if we look at the problems that the EU has of sanctions with the Myanmar Economic Holdings Corporation, Myanmar Economic Corporation, these are organizations to which military units and individuals